My father took this drug before he suddenly died. Annie Carter's voice was barely above a whisper, but it stopped Jonathan Whitmore's hand inches from the glass of water. On the table between them sat a silver tray, 2 white tablets, and a small amber bottle, with a thin blue-silver band around its neck. A shallow crescent had been pressed into the gray cap. Jonathan looked at the bottle, then at the 18-year-old standing beside his bed. "What did you just say? What does your father have to do with me?" Annie hesitated. I know I'm not allowed to interfere with your medication." She had been reminded of that rule from the day she arrived at Whitmore Estate. She was an intern, not a licensed nurse. She could carry sealed medicine, record delivery times, and report anything unusual. She could not open a bottle, alter a dose, or question a physician's instructions without evidence. But her father had died because too many people had followed instructions without asking questions. She pointed at the bottle, the mark on the cap, the blue line around the glass. "I saw both of them in the emergency room the night my father died." Jonathan slowly withdrew his hand from the water. "You've only worked here a few weeks. Do you understand who you're speaking to and how serious this accusation is?" "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Whitmore. Your name is on the hospital where my father died. It's on the scholarship program that hired me. And it's on the bill I still can't pay." Her hands closed into fists. "And I know this bottle has a silver blue band and the letters CV9 printed underneath. It looks exactly like the drug they gave my father before they claimed he died from a minor stroke." Jonathan studied her face. The uncertainty he expected from a frightened teenager was not there. Annie was angry, but her anger had not made her careless. "Who prepared this tray?" "Dr. Cole's office delivered it sealed. Miss Price told me to bring it upstairs." "You didn't open it?" "No, sir." "And you are certain you have seen this drug before?" Annie glanced at the closed bedroom door where Eleanor Price had gone downstairs to handle a call from the hospital. "I'm certain. The same bottle, with the same markings and whatever is inside it, was given to my father shortly before he died." Jonathan pressed the call button beside the bed. No light appeared on the control panel. He pressed it again. Nothing happened. "Tell me what happened to him." Annie remained beside the tray. "My father worked maintenance at Whitmore Memorial. Heating systems, air ducts, elevators, anything people ignored until it stopped working." "When did he die?" 3 weeks before I started here." Jonathan looked back at the bottle. "What was wrong with him?" "That was the strange part. Almost nothing." Annie clasped her hands to keep them from trembling. "He was repairing a ventilation duct in the old wing. A piece of sheet metal slipped and cut his palm. The wound needed stitches, but when I reached the emergency room, he was walking and talking. He was more upset about missing the rest of his shift than he was about the pain." "What did the doctors tell you?" "They said he needed a tetanus shot and another medication to prevent complications." Annie nodded toward the amber bottle. "A nurse brought in a bottle that looked exactly like this one. My father asked what it was, but she said the doctor had already approved it." "Did you hear the name of the drug?" "No." Dr. Cole entered the room before they gave it to him. Jonathan's expression changed. "Adrian Cole treated your father?" "Yes." "What happened after your father took the medicine?" Everything was still clearly etched in Annie's memory. "He said his mouth tasted like metal, then his hands became cold. I thought he was frightened, so I held one of them. His pulse felt too slow." She paused. Jonathan did not interrupt her. "My father asked the nurse what they had given him. Nobody answered. Dr. Cole said it was probably anxiety and told me to step outside." "You left him?" "They made me." The answer came out harder than Annie intended. "About 10 minutes later, I heard an alarm. When they finally let me back in, 6 people were standing around the bed. My father was conscious for only a few seconds. He grabbed my wrist and said, 'Don't let them give me the second dose.' Then his heart stopped." Jonathan's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "There was a second bottle?" "I saw one on the cart." "Same color, same cap. What explanation did the hospital give you?" "An undiagnosed heart condition." "Did your father have heart trouble?" "He worked 10-hour shifts, climbed ladders, and walked home whenever he couldn't afford the bus. He had high blood pressure, but he had never collapsed." Jonathan rose too quickly. He swayed, and Annie instinctively reached for his arm. He pulled away. "I'm fine. You're not supposed to stand without your cane." "I said I'm fine." Annie lowered her hand. "That's what my father said in the emergency room." For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Jonathan picked up the bottle without removing the cap. He turned it toward the bedside lamp until he could see the bottom. Beneath the amber glass was a faded marking. Svadeviet. The color left his face. You recognize it, Annie said. Jonathan placed the bottle back on the tray with care. What was your father's name? Marcus Carter. The silence that followed was different from the one before it. Jonathan no longer looked suspicious. He looked as though someone had opened a room inside his memory that had remained locked for 19 years. Marcus Carter, he murmured. Then he looked directly at Annie. Did he have a scar through his left eyebrow? Her shoulders stiffened. How do you know that? Did he repair watches? He repaired anything people brought him. Did he ever mention a wooden boat? Annie stepped away from the bed. Who were you to my father? Jonathan studied her face as though searching for someone he had lost. Marcus used to rub his thumb against his index finger when he was angry. You're doing it now. Annie looked down. Her fingers were repeating the movement without her noticing. She stopped. My father never talked about rich people, she said. He never mentioned this house. He only kept one photograph. She opened the notebook she used to record medication deliveries. An old photograph slipped from between the pages and landed near Jonathan's feet. He bent and picked it up. Two young men stood beside a wooden boat. Marcus was smiling with one arm across the shoulders of a taller white man. Jonathan stared at his own younger face. My father said that man was his brother, Annie said. He said he once trusted him more than anyone in the world. Jonathan's thumb moved across the cracked surface of the photograph. Marcus was my younger brother. Annie released a breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though there was no amusement in it. That's impossible. Before she could utter another word to reject that impossible truth, the electronic lock outside the bedroom snapped open with a sharp click. Jonathan's head turned toward the door. A shadow appeared beneath it, growing longer across the polished floor as someone approached from the hallway. The handle began to move, slowly and deliberately, while the disabled call panel beside Jonathan's bed remained dark. Whoever was entering believed Jonathan had already taken the medicine. The door opened without a knock. A man in a dark suit stepped inside carrying a slim leather case. A hospital identification badge was clipped to his jacket, though Annie could not read the name from where she stood. His eyes went first to the amber bottle, then to the glass of water beside Jonathan's hand. A flicker of relief crossed his face. Mr. Whitmore, he said, I wasn't told anyone would still be here. Jonathan folded the old photograph and slipped it beneath the blanket. Before Annie could react, he leaned against the pillows, lowered his shoulders, and let exhaustion settle over his face. His breathing slowed. The girl brought my medication, he said weakly. She was just leaving. The man looked at Annie. Then you should go. Annie remained where she was. The tension had disappeared from Jonathan's face, but she could see the calculation behind his half-closed eyes. He was pretending the medicine had taken effect. Jonathan lifted one hand as though the movement required all his remaining strength. No, Annie stays. The man's expression shifted. You need to rest, sir. She's part of the care team. She's only an intern. Jonathan rested his head against the pillow. Then she can learn what happens when a patient reacts badly to medication. Annie understood the warning beneath his words. He did not want her alone in the hallway. And he did not want the stranger to know what they had discovered. The man approached the table. He barely examined the bottle. His attention remained fixed on Jonathan's face. Are you feeling dizzy? A little. Are your hands cold? Jonathan glanced at his fingers. Yes. Any unusual taste in your mouth? Annie held her breath. Those were the same symptoms Marcus had described before his heart stopped. Jonathan did not look at her. Metallic. The man nodded, almost to himself. That can happen. He opened the leather case and removed a compact blood pressure monitor. Annie watched him fasten the cuff around Jonathan's arm. His movements were practiced, but he never verified Jonathan's identity or asked when the medication had supposedly been taken. Where is Miss Price? Annie asked, handling a call downstairs. What department are you with? The man glanced at her. Dr. Cole's private medical team. What is your name? That isn't necessary. I need your employee number for the medication record. Jonathan gave a faint cough. Answer her. After a brief pause, the man turned his badge toward Annie. Martin Hale, Clinical Services. Annie wrote the name in her notebook, though Eleanor had never mentioned anyone named Martin Hale. Hale studied the blood pressure reading and frowned. Jonathan's pressure was lower than normal, but not dangerously so. Annie wondered whether he had slowed his breathing enough to make the performance convincing. You should sleep soon. Hale said. The medication is designed to work gradually. Jonathan's gaze drifted toward the amber bottle. Will there be another dose? Dr. Cole will decide that in the morning. Annie tightened her grip on the pen. Jonathan kept his eyes unfocused. What should I do if I feel worse before then? If you experience any problems, press the call button, sir. It doesn't appear to be working. For the first time, Hale looked at the dark control panel beside the bed. His surprise lasted less than a second. I'll notify security. Do that. Hale picked up the silver tray. Jonathan's hand closed around its edge. Leave it. Sir, I should return the unused packaging. I said leave it. For one brief moment, the weakness vanished from Jonathan's voice. Then he released the tray and allowed his hand to fall back onto the blanket. My apologies, he murmured. I'm tired. Hale studied him before slowly returning the tray to the table. Of course. He looked at Annie. Make sure he remains in bed. I will. Hale walked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned back. Try not to worry, Mr. Whitmore. Dr. Cole has managed your family's health for a very long time. Jonathan kept his eyes closed. That is exactly what worries me. Hale stopped, perhaps uncertain whether he had heard correctly. Then he stepped into the hallway and closed the door. Jonathan did not move until the electronic lock clicked. His eyes opened. Don't touch the bottle. I wasn't going to. Don't touch the water either. Annie lowered her notebook. Who was that? A man I've seen twice at hospital board meetings. I've never known him to provide patient care. You lied to him. So did he. Jonathan sat upright and removed the photograph from beneath the blanket. His hands were steady now. You said my father was your brother, Annie said. Prove it. Jonathan looked at the two young men beside the wooden boat. Marcus was 4 years younger than me. He was afraid of deep water, though he refused to admit it. The summer this picture was taken, he spent 3 months repairing that boat. On the day we launched it, he dropped the key into the river. Annie remembered her father telling that story, though he had never identified the man beside him. My father said his brother accused him of doing it on purpose. I did. For how long? Jonathan looked down at the photograph. 19 years. Annie folded her arms. My father never mentioned having a billionaire brother. He lived with bills he couldn't pay while your family had more money than it could spend. Why did he use the name Carter if he was a Whitmore? Carter was his mother's surname. My father married Denise Carter after my mother died. She was black? Yes. And your family didn't approve. Some of them didn't. What about you? No. The answer came quickly, but Annie refused to let him hide behind it. Then why did my father live as though he had no family? Jonathan looked down at the photograph. I was told he stole $12 million from the family trust. I was shown bank transfers, hotel records, and photographs of him living overseas. My father never lived overseas. I know that now. No. You know what I've told you. That isn't the same as knowing what happened. Jonathan accepted the correction. Did he ever try to contact me? He never mentioned your name. Sometimes your foundation appeared on television, and he would turn it off. Did he receive letters? We moved several times when I was young. He said someone always managed to find us. Jonathan's attention sharpened. Who? He never said. He only told me that some people knock before entering your life, while others wait until you believe you're safe. Did he keep hospital records? Old files? A storage key? I don't know. He kept an old metal toolbox in his bedroom, but he never let me open the bottom compartment. Where is it now? At my house. Jonathan stood and reached for his cane. You're not going anywhere, Annie said. You nearly fell 5 minutes ago. That was an act. The low blood pressure wasn't. He stopped. Annie stepped closer, keeping the medication tray between them. You want answers about my father. So do I. But you don't get to give me orders because we share blood. Jonathan studied her. You sound like Marcus. I'll take that as a compliment. You should. He looked at the photograph, then at the closed door. I believed my brother abandoned this family. Tonight, I learned he died inside a hospital carrying my name. Someone placed the same drug in my bedroom and sent a man to confirm that I had taken it. Jonathan placed the photograph in Annie's hand. I still don't know who lied to me, he said. I only know the lie lasted long enough to bury your father. If Annie's courage and the truth she is fighting for touched your heart, take a moment to like this video and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. You never know, someone near you might be watching this story with you right now. Your support helps us share more inspiring stories like Annie's. Annie looked down at Marcus's younger face. And now? Jonathan turned toward the disabled call panel. Now we find out who believed I was too weak to ask questions. Jonathan reached for the phone on the nightstand, stopped before touching it, and looked at the dead call panel again. "Do you have your cell phone?" he asked. Annie took it from the pocket of her uniform. "The battery is almost dead." "Call Miss Price. Put it on speaker." Eleanor answered after the second ring. "Annie? Why are you calling me from upstairs?" "Are you still downstairs?" Jonathan asked. There was a brief silence. "Mr. Whitmore, come back to my room. Bring Owen Blake, 2 evidence bags, and no one else." "What happened?" "I'll explain when the door is closed." Jonathan ended the call before Eleanor could ask another question. He moved the water glass and the amber bottle farther apart without touching either one. "You give orders easily," Annie said. "I've had practice. That doesn't mean people enjoy receiving them." Marcus used to say something similar. Jonathan almost mentioned it, then decided Annie had heard enough comparisons for one night. Within minutes, Eleanor returned with Owen Blake, Whitmore's head of security. Owen was a broad man in his late 40s with close-cut gray hair and the patient expression of someone who preferred facts to explanations. He locked the door behind them. Jonathan pointed to the tray. "No one touches the bottle or the water without gloves." Eleanor put on a pair from her medical bag. "What am I looking at?" "CV9, Annie said. Eleanor glanced at her, then examined the marking beneath the amber glass. Her face remained controlled, but her hand stopped moving. "That drug isn't listed in your treatment plan," she said to Jonathan. "Martin Hale said it came from Cole's team." "Martin who?" Annie opened her notebook. "Martin Hale, clinical sir." Owen removed his phone and stepped toward the window while making a call. Eleanor sealed the bottle and glass in separate evidence bags, then photographed the tray and the disabled call panel. "Did you take anything?" she asked Jonathan. "No." "Did the bottle arrive sealed?" Annie answered. "The medication package was sealed when Dr. Cole's office delivered it. I brought it upstairs exactly as I received it." Eleanor nodded. "I watched her sign it out. She didn't open anything." Jonathan noticed the tension leave Annie's shoulders. It was slight, but it told him how prepared she had been to defend herself. Owen returned from the window. "There is no Martin Hale employed by Whitmore Memorial, Whitmore Clinical Services, or Cole's private office. He had a hospital badge," Annie said. "A temporary contractor badge. Those can be issued through 3 administrative offices." Owen looked at Jonathan. "Security footage shows him entering through the east service door 28 minutes ago. The camera outside this room lost its feed 6 minutes before he came upstairs. Where is he now?" "Gone. He left through the kitchen corridor while I was coming up." Eleanor looked toward the call panel. "Someone redirected me downstairs with a false message from the hospital." Jonathan's voice hardened. "And someone disabled the room before Hale arrived." Annie looked from one adult to another. "So he came here to see whether the medicine worked." No one contradicted her. Owen asked Jonathan to move to another bedroom while the room was secured. Jonathan refused until Eleanor threatened to arrange his transfer to the hospital. "You would send me back to the place where this bottle came from?" "I would send you somewhere with a functioning heart monitor," Eleanor said. "Your pride is not a medical device." Jonathan gave in. They moved to a smaller guest suite across the hall. Owen posted 2 guards outside and began reviewing the estate's access records. Eleanor checked Jonathan's blood pressure again, then examined Annie's face as if she expected to find an injury. "I'm all right," Annie said. "You've had your employer claim your dead father was his brother, identified a suspicious drug, and watched an unknown man enter a secured room. You are not required to be all right." The kindness in Eleanor's voice nearly unsettled Annie more than the danger had. "My father's toolbox is at home," she said. "Jonathan thinks there may be records inside it." Eleanor looked at Jonathan. "You questioned her already?" "She questioned me just as much." "Good." Jonathan ignored the comment. "The house may not be safe." "It's my house," Annie said. "That doesn't make it secure." "It made it secure enough while my father and I were too poor for anyone here to notice us." The words struck their target. Jonathan lowered his voice. "I noticed Marcus. You noticed the version of him someone delivered to your desk." Owen returned before Jonathan could answer. "The access code used on the bedroom door belongs to Dr. Cole's office." Annie looked at him. "Does that prove Cole sent Hale?" "No," Owen said. "It proves someone used his credentials. That may be the same thing, or it may be what we're supposed to believe." Jonathan appreciated the restraint. Annie did too. "We need the toolbox," she said. Owen checked his watch. I'll take a team. No. 3 people spoke at once. Annie was the only one who did not reconsider. If strangers enter my home, Mrs. Louise next door will call the police before they reach the porch, she said. She already believes every black SUV belongs to either the government or a funeral home. Despite himself, Owen smiled. I'm going, Annie continued. You can come with me, but no team marching through my neighborhood. Jonathan reached for his cane. Then we leave now. Eleanor stepped in front of him. You are staying here. He is my brother. He was your brother when you ignored him for 19 years, Annie said. 1 more hour won't change that. Jonathan stared at her, then sat back down. Owen drove Annie west in an unmarked gray Ford. Neither spoke much during the ride. Baltimore changed outside the windows, from wooded estates to office blocks, corner stores, row houses, and streetlights that flickered when the wind picked up. Mrs. Louise's porch light was on when they arrived. The older woman opened her door before Annie reached the steps. She wore a robe over a church t-shirt and held a wooden spoon like a weapon. Annie Carter, where have you been? And who is this? Owen Blake. He works security. For whom? Annie looked toward the dark windows of her own house. For the family my father never told me about. Mrs. Louise lowered the spoon. Annie crossed the narrow yard and put her key into the front door. It turned without resistance. She had locked the deadbolt that morning. Owen moved in front of her. Stay here. He pushed the door open. Nothing inside appeared disturbed. The old couch remained beneath the window. Marcus's work boots were still beside the radiator. A grocery receipt lay on the table where Annie had left it. She walked past Owen and entered her father's bedroom. The metal toolbox sat beneath the bed. For 1 second, relief warmed her chest. Then she noticed the bottom drawer. It was open. The compartment her father had forbidden her to touch was empty. Annie knelt beside the toolbox and stared at the empty compartment. The drawer had always been locked. Marcus kept the key on his work ring, separate from the keys to the house and his old pickup. Even after he sold the truck, that small brass key remained with him. At least, Annie had assumed it did. Owen crouched near the bed without touching the toolbox. When did you last see this closed? The morning my father died. He came in here to change his shirt before work. Did he open it? I don't know. I was making coffee. Owen examined the metal around the lock. No scratches. Whoever opened it had a key. Annie looked toward the bedroom door. The hospital returned his belongings after he died. What did they give you? His wallet, his phone, his wedding ring, and the keys from his belt. Do you still have them? In the kitchen, Mrs. Louise remained on the front porch, watching through the open doorway. Owen asked her to stay outside until he finished checking the rooms. She agreed, though her expression suggested she considered his instructions optional. The house showed no obvious signs of a search. Drawers were closed. The mattress had not been moved. Marcus's clothes still hung in the closet in the order he preferred. Work shirts on the left, church clothes on the right. Someone had known exactly where to look. Annie walked into the kitchen and opened the ceramic bowl beside the refrigerator. Marcus's keys were beneath 2 bus passes and a grocery coupon. The small brass key was missing. I didn't notice, she said. There were so many forms at the hospital. They gave me a plastic bag and told me to sign. Who handed it to you? A nurse at the discharge desk. I don't remember her name. Was Dr. Cole there? No. He spoke to me once after my father died. Then someone from administration took over. Owen photographed the keys before asking Annie to place them in a clean envelope. Someone may have removed the toolbox key before the hospital returned his property. Then they already knew about the drawer. Probably. Annie leaned against the counter. Why wait 3 weeks to empty it? They may not have known where your father lived, or they may have been watching to see whether you found whatever he kept there. The thought made the room feel smaller. Marcus had changed their address 4 times while Annie was growing up. He had never explained why. She had assumed each move involved rent, broken plumbing, or another landlord raising the price. Mrs. Louise tapped the front window with her spoon. Owen sighed and opened the door. Did you see anyone enter this house today? Not today, she said, but a black sedan sat across the street Tuesday night. What kind? The expensive kind that doesn't belong on this block. Did anyone get out? A man did. White, maybe 60. Gray coat. He stood near Annie's steps for 10 minutes, then left. Annie frowned. Why didn't you call me? You were at work. and he never touched the door. I took down the license plate. Owen's expression changed. You did? Mrs. Louise reached into the pocket of her robe and handed him a folded church bulletin. A Maryland plate number was written across the section advertising Sunday breakfast. My husband taught me to write things down, she said. Memory gets blamed for too much when people are simply careless. Owen entered the number into his phone and sent it to someone. Annie looked at Mrs. Louise. Did Dad ever give you anything to keep? The older woman considered the question. Once. About 2 months ago. What was it? A coffee can. Annie blinked. You kept a coffee can for 2 months and never told me? Your father said not to give it to you unless something happened to him. Something did happen. I know, baby. The gentleness in Mrs. Louise's voice weakened Annie's anger. Then why didn't you give it to me after the funeral? Because your father added one more condition. He said I should wait until you asked the right question. What question? Mrs. Louise looked at Owen, then back at Annie. Whether he left something outside the house. Annie closed her eyes for a moment. Even in death, Marcus was forcing her to slow down and pay attention. Mrs. Louise led them next door. Her living room smelled of furniture polish, and the peach cobbler cooling on the kitchen counter. Family photographs covered the walls. Unlike the Whitmore portraits, none had brass plaques. The names were remembered because people still spoke them. She opened a cabinet beneath the sink and removed a red coffee can sealed with silver duct tape. My father put evidence in this? Annie asked. I didn't open it. You weren't curious? Of course I was, but curiosity is not permission. Owen checked the can for wires or unusual weight before handing it to Annie. Inside were 3 objects wrapped in an old shop towel. A small storage key stamped with the number 317, a hospital access card bearing Marcus's photograph, and a folded note. Annie recognized her father's handwriting. If you are reading this, they either found me or I finally ran out of time. Her vision blurred, but she forced herself to continue. Do not trust what the hospital says happened to me. Do not take this to the police until you know who signs their charity checks. Locker 317 is in the old maintenance corridor beneath Whitmore Memorial. What is inside belongs to Jonathan. Annie stopped. The final sentence was written below the others, as though Marcus had added it later. He may not believe you. Tell him I never spent the money. Owen read over her shoulder but said nothing. Annie folded the note carefully. We need to call Jonathan. We will. No, I need to tell him myself. Owen studied her face. All right. He dialed Jonathan and handed her the phone. Jonathan answered immediately. Did you find the toolbox? It was open before we arrived. The bottom drawer is empty. A long silence followed. But my father left something with our neighbor. Annie continued. A key to locker 317 at the hospital. And a note addressed to you. What does it say? Annie looked at the words again. He said he never spent the money. Jonathan's breathing changed on the other end of the line. Bring me the note. No. Annie, you can read it when we open the locker together. That hospital is not safe. Neither was your bedroom. Jonathan had no answer to that. Annie closed her hand around the small key. For 19 years, everyone decided what my father was allowed to say and who was allowed to hear him. That ends now. When Jonathan finally spoke, his voice was quieter. Then we go together. Outside, a car door closed somewhere along the block. Owen moved to the window and pulled the curtain aside. The black sedan was back. Owen kept 2 fingers against the curtain and watched the black sedan idle across the street. Same plate? Annie asked. Mrs. Louise moved closer to the window, still holding the wooden spoon. Same car, she said. Same driver, too. Owen stepped away from the glass. Turn off the kitchen light. Mrs. Louise did not move. Young man, I have lived on this block for 37 years. Nobody tells me when to turn off my own lights without explaining why. The person in that car may be watching Annie's house. Then darkness will only tell him we noticed. Owen considered her point, then gave a small nod. Leave the lights on. Stay away from the windows. Mrs. Louise lowered the spoon. That sounds more reasonable. Annie looked down at the key marked 317. It felt too small to carry the weight her father had placed on it. Can you tell who owns the car? She asked. I sent the plate in, Owen said. We'll have an answer soon. The sedan remained at the curb for another minute. Then its headlights came on, and it pulled away without urgency. Annie watched until the red taillights disappeared. They wanted us to see them, she said. Maybe, Owen replied. or they wanted to know whether you found what they missed. Mrs. Louise folded her arms. Marcus always said fear makes people careless. He also said rich people think poor neighborhoods don't have witnesses. Owen looked at the church bulletin with the license plate written across it. Your neighbor may be the best witness we have. She usually is, Annie said. Her phone vibrated. Jonathan's name appeared on the screen. Are you still at the house? He asked when she answered. At Mrs. Louise's. Stay there. I'm sending another vehicle. Owen already has one. The sedan outside may have recorded it. Annie looked at Owen. He nodded. Jonathan continued. Eleanor is coming with me. You're supposed to be resting. I rested while everyone lied to me for 19 years. It was not productive. Despite herself, Annie almost smiled. 20 minutes later, a dark green station wagon stopped behind Mrs. Louise's Buick. Eleanor drove. Jonathan sat in the passenger seat wearing a wool coat over his clothes from the estate. His cane rested between his knees. Mrs. Louise opened the door before they reached the porch. You're Jonathan Whitmore, she said. Jonathan stopped on the bottom step. Yes, ma'am. You look older than you do on television. Eleanor turned her face to hide a smile. Jonathan accepted the observation. Television has better lighting. Mrs. Louise studied him. Marcus kept every newspaper article about you, even when he pretended not to care. Annie watched the words strike him. Did he ever talk about me? Jonathan asked. Not often. A person can avoid a name and still build half his life around it. Mrs. Louise let them inside and served coffee without asking whether anyone wanted it. Jonathan received his in a chipped mug bearing the words "World's Best Grandpa." My husband's, she explained. He has been gone 9 years. The mug still works. Jonathan wrapped both hands around it but did not drink. Annie placed Marcus's note and the storage key on the table. Eleanor read the note first, then passed it to Jonathan. He stopped at the final sentence. He may not believe you. Tell him I never spent the money. Jonathan read it twice. I should have known, he said. Annie sat across from him. Why? Marcus hated expensive hotels. He said every room looked like someone had removed the evidence that people lived there. The reports showed him staying in places he would have mocked. Yet you believed them? Yes. Jonathan did not defend himself, and that made Annie's anger harder to use. Owen's phone rang. He stepped into the hallway, spoke for less than a minute, then returned. The sedan is registered to Whitmore Health Administrative Services. Jonathan's gaze lifted. Which office? The vehicle pool serves 6 departments, including the legal division, executive records, and Dr. Cole's private team. So we still don't know who sent it, Annie said. No, Owen replied. But whoever used it knew enough to avoid a private registration. Jonathan reached for the key. Annie closed her hand over it first. We agreed to go together. I remember. No private security team searching the locker before I get there. Agreed. And no removing anything without making copies. Jonathan met her eyes. Agreed. Eleanor set down her coffee. Neither of you is going to that hospital tonight. Jonathan turned toward her. We cannot wait. You can if the alternative is walking into a building controlled by the people who prepared that medication. Owen nodded. She's right. We need access records and a route that doesn't announce your arrival. Annie looked at the clock. It was almost midnight. Then where do we go? Jonathan remained silent for a moment. There is someone who may recognize the drug and know why Marcus trusted locker 317. Who? Dr. Helen Brooks. She worked in pathology at Whitmore Memorial when Marcus disappeared from the family. Eleanor's expression became guarded. Helen has refused every invitation connected to Whitmore for years. She may speak to Annie. Annie heard the part Jonathan did not say. Helen might speak to Marcus's daughter even if she refused to speak to the brother who had failed him. Does she live nearby? Annie asked. Catonsville. Mrs. Louise began wrapping slices of peach cobbler in foil. Owen stared at her. What are you doing? Nobody should confront a 19-year family scandal on an empty stomach. She handed one package to Annie and another to Jonathan. Jonathan looked at the foil in his hand. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Mrs. Louise said. I don't know whether I like you. That seems fair. Before leaving, Annie returned to her house for a coat. Marcus's boots still sat beside the radiator. She touched the worn leather with 2 fingers. What were you trying to protect me from, Dad? Outside, Jonathan waited by the station wagon. He did not tell her to hurry. During the drive to Catonsville, Baltimore passed in wet reflections beyond the windows. Annie sat in the back beside Eleanor. holding the coffee can on her lap. Jonathan remained quiet in front. Dr. Helen Brooks lived in a brick house at the end of a narrow street lined with old maple trees. A porch lamp glowed above the door. Owen knocked. Several locks opened from the inside before an older black woman appeared in a blue robe. Her silver hair was wrapped in a scarf, and her eyes moved from Owen to Eleanor, then settled on Jonathan. "You have a great deal of nerve coming to my home after midnight," she said. Jonathan lowered his head slightly. "Yes, ma'am." Helen then noticed Annie. Her expression changed. She stepped closer and studied Annie's face without speaking. "You have Denise's eyes," she said at last, "but that look you're giving me belonged entirely to Marcus." Annie's grip tightened around the coffee can. "You knew my father?" Helen looked past her toward Jonathan. "I knew him well enough to understand why he died poor," she said. "And I knew this family well enough to understand why no one ever asked the right questions." She opened the door wider. "Come inside. If Marcus finally left you the key, then somebody has already started running out of time." Helen Brooks led them into a living room filled with books, framed medical certificates, and photographs of 3 generations. A half-finished cup of tea sat beside an open mystery novel. The television had been muted, but the captions continued moving across the screen. "Sit," she said. "Mr. Whitmore, take the chair with arms. You look like pride is the only thing keeping you upright." Jonathan obeyed without comment. Annie sat on the edge of the couch with the red coffee can on her lap. Eleanor took the seat beside her, while Owen remained near the front window. Helen disappeared into the kitchen and returned carrying a pitcher of water and 4 mismatched glasses. "I don't drink anything after midnight that costs more than tap water," she said. "Expensive people have already caused enough trouble tonight." Jonathan accepted a glass. "You knew Marcus was alive." Helen's eyes settled on him. "That is not the first question you should ask." "What should I ask?" "Whether he tried to reach you." Jonathan lowered the glass. Helen sat opposite him. "He did. More than once." Annie felt Jonathan become still. "How?" he asked. "Letters, telephone messages. Once through a lawyer who withdrew from the case 2 days later. Marcus even came to the hospital during a board meeting, but security escorted him out before he reached the executive floor. I was told he had left the country." "You were told what made your life easier?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. "You think I wanted to believe my brother had betrayed me? I think people often accept a painful lie when the truth would demand courage from them." The room fell quiet. Annie opened the coffee can and placed Marcus's note on the table. "He said locker 317 contains something that belongs to Jonathan." Helen did not touch it. "Your father was careful," she said. "Not careful enough to save himself, but careful enough to give the truth more than one place to hide." "You know what's in the locker?" "No. Marcus stopped telling me details after my office was searched." "By whom?" "Men with hospital credentials and no medical reason to be near pathology." Owen shifted away from the window. "When did that happen?" 19 years ago, shortly before Marcus vanished from the Whitmore family." Jonathan leaned forward. "What did Marcus discover?" Helen studied him before answering. "A pattern in several deaths. Patients admitted for minor injuries or routine procedures developed the same symptoms within hours. A metallic taste, cold hands, a slowing pulse, then cardiac arrest." "CV9, Annie said. Helen nodded. "Cardiovex. 9 was developed as an experimental rhythm control drug. On paper, the project ended before human trials. Every remaining vial was supposedly destroyed. But they weren't," Eleanor said. "No, someone kept a private supply." Jonathan looked at the red can. "Marcus found it?" "He found inventory records that didn't match the destruction report. He also discovered that several patients who died had received care from the same private medical team." "Dr. Cole's team," Annie said. Helen's face gave nothing away. Adrian Cole was a junior physician then. Ambitious, well-connected, and protected by people whose names were printed on buildings. Jonathan heard the accusation. "My name. Your family's name," Helen corrected. "Marcus did not come to me because I was his friend. He came because I worked in pathology and could compare tissue samples without asking the hospital administration for permission." "What did you find?" "Evidence that the deaths were not natural. Before I could complete a formal report, the samples disappeared. My access was suspended, and I was accused of mishandling patient material. Annie looked at the certificates on Helen's wall. Did they fire you? They offered me a choice: resign quietly or lose my license publicly. And you left. I did. There was no attempt to excuse the decision. Annie's voice hardened. My father didn't get to leave. Helen met her eyes. No, he paid the price some of us were too frightened to pay. The honesty took some of the anger out of Annie, though not the hurt. Jonathan set his glass down. Was Marcus accused of stealing the drug before or after he came to you? After. The financial accusations appeared within days. $12 million transferred through accounts carrying his name. Security footage showed him entering restricted areas. Witnesses claimed he planned to sell research data. All of it was manufactured, Jonathan said. I could not prove that then. You could have told me. Helen's expression sharpened. Would you have listened? Jonathan opened his mouth but did not answer. You had lawyers, board members, and your uncle telling you Marcus was dangerous, Helen continued. I was a black woman already accused of misconduct, defending a black man your family had decided was a thief. Tell me honestly, Mr. Whitmore. Whose version would you have placed on the boardroom table? Jonathan looked down at his hands. Not mine, Helen said, and not his. Annie thought of the television reports that had called her desperate before anyone asked what she knew. 19 years had passed, but the method had not changed. First question the person's character, then no one needed to examine the evidence. Justice isn't fair when powerful people get to write the first version of the truth, she said. Jonathan looked at her. Then we make sure they don't write the last. Helen reached beneath the table and removed a small metal lockbox. From it, she took an old hospital map. The maintenance corridor has been renovated twice, but the original lockers remain behind the boiler control room. The public elevators won't take you there. She marked a service entrance on the map. Marcus's old access card may still open the first gate if the legacy system hasn't been replaced. After that, you'll need the key. Owen examined the route. How many cameras? 3 when I worked there. Probably more now. Can we enter without alerting administration? Helen looked toward Jonathan. Not if the hospital knows its owner is coming. Jonathan nodded. Then the owner stays behind. Annie turned to him. You said we would go together. I also said the hospital may not be safe. You don't get to change the agreement because the truth is becoming inconvenient. It is not inconvenience. Someone placed that drug beside my bed tonight, and my father left the locker for both of us. Helen raised one hand before the argument could continue. You will all go at first light, she said. The early maintenance shift begins at 5:30. Staff will be moving through the lower corridors, which makes 4 people less noticeable than 4 people entering an empty building at midnight. Eleanor nodded. Jonathan needs monitoring until then. I don't need... Helen looked at him. Jonathan stopped. Yes, ma'am. Annie glanced toward the window. Dawn was still hours away. Helen placed one finger on the number 317 printed beside the old locker room. Get some rest while you can, she said. Once that locker opens, Marcus will no longer be the only dead man in this family asking questions. At 5:12 the next morning, Whitmore Memorial Hospital was already awake. Delivery trucks idled near the service entrance, while kitchen staff rolled carts through the loading bay. Nurses ending the night shift crossed paths with maintenance workers carrying tool bags and paper cups of coffee. No one paid much attention to 4 tired people entering through a side corridor. Annie wore Marcus's old hospital jacket over her uniform. His access card hung from a clip near her waist. The photograph on it had faded, but his name remained clear. Marcus Carter. Facilities maintenance. Jonathan walked beside her in a plain overcoat, his cane striking the floor with a steady rhythm. He had removed the watch and cufflinks he usually wore. Without the signs of wealth, he looked less like the man whose portrait hung in the lobby, and more like someone arriving for an early appointment. Owen led them toward a gray security gate near the boiler rooms. Helen followed with the folded hospital map inside her handbag. Annie placed Marcus's card against the reader. A red light appeared. She tried again. Nothing happened. The legacy system may have been disconnected, Owen said. Helen pointed toward a small keypad beneath the reader. Marcus never trusted electronic locks. Try his employee number. Annie looked at the card. It isn't printed here. His birthday, Jonathan said. April 17th. Annie entered 400 Asuten. The light turned green. She glanced at Jonathan. He used it for everything when we were young, he explained. Locks, bicycle chains, even the boat. The gate released with a soft buzz. Beyond it, the hallway narrowed. Exposed pipes ran along the ceiling, and the air smelled of detergent, rust, and heated metal. Annie had visited her father at work only twice, but the sounds brought back evenings when Marcus came home carrying the hospital on his clothes. They passed a break room where two maintenance workers were arguing about the Orioles over microwaved breakfast sandwiches. Neither man looked up. Helen stopped beside a faded sign marked Boiler Control. The old locker room should be through there. Owen checked the corridor before opening the door. Behind it stood 3 rows of dented metal lockers. Most had been painted blue, though patches of gray showed beneath the chipped surface. Locker 317 stood at the far end. Annie held the small brass key between her fingers. Jonathan stayed several feet behind her. "You should open it," he said. "My father wrote that what was inside belonged to you. He left the key for you." Annie placed it in the lock. "Then we open it together." The mechanism resisted before turning with a scrape. Inside hung one of Marcus's work shirts, still bearing a stitched Whitmore memorial patch. A pair of gloves rested on the upper shelf beside a roll of electrical tape and a metal flashlight. For a moment, the locker appeared ordinary. Then Annie noticed a large brown envelope taped beneath the shelf. She removed it and placed it on a nearby bench. Inside were copies of bank transfers, security access reports, and a resignation statement carrying Marcus's signature. A second folder contained a list of patients whose deaths had been classified as cardiac failure. Every page had notes written in Marcus's hand. Jonathan picked up one of the financial records. "This is the account they said held the stolen money." Annie read the address listed beneath Marcus's name. He never lived there. Helen leaned closer. That building belonged to a Whitmore subsidiary. Owen photographed each document before allowing anyone to turn the page. At the bottom of the envelope lay a small cassette recorder wrapped in a shop towel. A piece of masking tape had been placed across it. "For Jonathan, when he is ready." Jonathan stared at the words. Annie set the recorder on the bench and pressed play. Static filled the locker room. Then Marcus's voice emerged, older and more tired than the man in the photograph, but unmistakable to Annie. "Jonathan, if you're hearing this, then every other way I tried to reach you has failed." Jonathan lowered himself onto the bench. Marcus continued, "I did not steal the money. Richard moved it through an account, opened under my name. By the time I found out, the records had already been copied and sent to the board." Jonathan's hand tightened around the financial statement. "I was told to sign the resignation and surrender my claim to the trust. When I refused, they showed me photographs of Denise leaving her doctor's office. She was pregnant with Annie. They knew her appointment schedule. They knew which hospital we planned to use." Annie pressed one hand against her mouth. "I signed because Richard said my wife and child would disappear before anyone believed a word I said. I thought losing my name was better than losing them." The recording clicked, then resumed. "They told you I left with the money. I know because I saw one of the reports before they locked me out. The hotels, the foreign accounts, the letters, they were prepared in advance." Jonathan closed his eyes. Marcus's voice softened. "I tried to write to you. 3 letters came back unopened. The 4th never returned. I came to the hospital once, but security removed me before I reached the executive floor. I don't know whether you refused to see me or whether someone made that choice for you." Jonathan spoke quietly, though Marcus could no longer hear him. "I never knew." The recording continued. "CV9 was never destroyed. Cole kept part of the supply in a restricted storage room. I found inventory logs tying it to patients who died after minor procedures. Helen tried to help me prove it. They took her samples and called her careless. Helen looked away. If I am dead, do not accept the first cause they give you. The drug slows the heart and leaves little behind, unless someone knows what to test for." Annie remembered her father's cold hand in the emergency room. Marcus drew a long breath on the tape. "There is one more thing you need to understand. Richard did not remove me only because of what I discovered. He needed me outside the family trust. If anything happens to you, Annie becomes the next legal heir." Jonathan opened his eyes and looked at her. "That means she will never be safe while the original trust remains in force." The tape crackled. "If you ever meet my daughter, don't ask her to forgive you. Not at first. She has spent her whole life paying for choices made before she was born. Annie wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. Protect her if she lets you. Respect her if she doesn't. Marcus paused before saying the final words. And Jonathan, I never stopped being your brother, even when I needed you and you did not come. The recorder clicked off. No one spoke. Jonathan sat with his head lowered, Marcus's work shirt hanging behind him like the outline of a man who should have been standing there. After a while, Annie asked, Did you refuse his letters? No. Did you tell security to remove him? No. But you stopped looking. Jonathan raised his eyes. Yes. It was the only honest answer he had left. Owen examined another document from the envelope. There's a copy of the family trust here, but several pages are missing. Enough to prove Annie is an heir? Helen asked. Enough to raise the question, not enough to survive a legal challenge. Annie looked at the list of dead patients, then at the recorder. My father spent 19 years hiding pieces of the truth because he knew no one would believe the whole thing from him. Jonathan stood slowly. They will believe it now. A sound came from the corridor outside. Footsteps stopped near the boiler room door. Then someone tested the handle. The handle moved again. Owen raised one finger, signaling everyone to remain silent. He stepped beside the door while Annie gathered the papers into the brown envelope. Jonathan slipped the cassette recorder into his coat pocket. Maintenance? A man called from the corridor. Anybody in there? Helen exhaled. That sounds like Walter Jennings. She opened the door before Owen could object. A maintenance supervisor in gray coveralls stood outside holding a clipboard and a paper cup of coffee. He looked past Helen at the open locker, then at Jonathan. Recognition came slowly. Mr. Whitmore? Jonathan gave a restrained nod. Mr. Jennings. Walter removed his baseball cap. Sir, I didn't know you were visiting. I wasn't planning to. Walter looked at Annie wearing Marcus's old work jacket. His eyes settled on the name badge. Marcus's girl? Annie tightened her hold on the envelope. You knew my father? Worked beside him almost 12 years. Walter glanced at the locker. He told me never to let anyone cut that lock unless they had the key. Did anyone ask? Twice. First time was after he disappeared from the executive records. Second was 3 weeks ago, the morning after he died. Owen stepped closer. Who asked? Administrative compliance. They sent an email saying the locker contained hospital property. Did you open it? Walter shook his head. Marcus bought that locker himself before the renovation. It wasn't on the hospital inventory. I told them to bring me a court order, or stop wasting my time. Annie studied him. Why didn't you tell me? I didn't know how to find you. Your father didn't talk much about home. He said keeping work and family separate was the only way to keep one from poisoning the other. Walter looked toward the hall. You shouldn't stay. Administration sent a security officer down 10 minutes ago asking whether anyone had used the old service gate. Owen closed the locker. Is there another exit? Walter pointed toward the boiler room. Freight elevator behind the water tanks. It opens near the laundry dock. Camera's been broken since Christmas. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. Why hasn't it been repaired? Walter replaced his cap. Because every request I submit gets marked non-essential. Send the next one directly to me. Walter looked at him for a moment. With respect, sir. That's what Marcus used to tell us not to do. Jonathan accepted the criticism, without protest. They left through the boiler room and reached the station wagon without being stopped. Annie kept the envelope against her chest during the drive back to Helen's house. No one spoke until Owen had scanned and copied every page. He placed the incomplete trust document beside his laptop. This confirms Marcus remained in the line of succession after leaving the company, he said. The resignation removed him from management, not from the family trust. Jonathan stood near the fireplace. Richard told me the resignation covered both. It didn't, at least not in this version. Annie sat beside Helen at the dining table. What happens now that my father is dead? Owen turned the document toward her. His claim passes to his lawful child. Annie stared at the page. Me. Yes. She looked at Jonathan. And if something happens to you, you become the primary beneficiary, Owen said. The words did not feel like good news. Annie thought of the amber bottle beside Jonathan's water and the missing key from Marcus's belongings. What happens if both of us die? Owen hesitated. Jonathan answered. The trust passes to the next branch of the Whitmore family. Richard's branch, Helen said. The room became quiet. Annie looked at the incomplete pages. So my father wasn't removed because they believed he stole money. No, Jonathan said. He was accused of stealing money because someone needed him removed, and now someone is trying to do the same thing to us. Jonathan did not soften the truth. It appears that way. Owen opened another file on his computer. There's more. I checked how Annie entered the estate internship program. I applied through the foundation website, Annie said. I had recommendations from my science teacher and the church clinic. You did, and your scores placed you high enough to qualify. But the original intake committee put you on the waiting list. Annie frowned. Then how was I accepted? An executive review moved your application to the top. Whose review? Owen turned the screen toward them. The authorization had come from the office of the chairman emeritus. Richard Whitmore. Jonathan read the line twice. Richard never involves himself in entry-level hiring. Apparently he did this time, Owen said. Annie pushed back from the table. He knew who I was. We can't prove that yet, Owen replied. He chose me out of hundreds of applicants and placed me inside Jonathan's house 6 weeks before someone tried to give him the same drug that killed my father. Helen rested a hand on Annie's wrist. Suspicion is justified. Certainty still requires evidence. Annie did not pull away, but her voice remained hard. People keep telling me to wait for evidence, while everyone with evidence keeps dying. Jonathan moved closer to the table. Your work at the estate was real. Eleanor trusted you because you earned it. That isn't the point. I know. No, you don't. I thought I had finally earned something that could get me out of debt and into college. Now I find out someone may have handed it to me because they wanted me close enough to watch. Jonathan had no useful reassurance to offer. Telling Annie that she deserved the position would not change why Richard might have opened the door. What would he have expected me to do? She asked. Owen considered the question. Bring your father's belongings into the estate. Mention records or documents. Perhaps make contact with Jonathan without understanding why it mattered. Or take the blame if Jonathan died, Helen added. Annie looked at the table. A poor black teenager with unpaid hospital bills, working near a wealthy patient's medication, would be an easy story to sell. Richard would not need to prove much at first. He would only need the public to believe the accusation long enough for the evidence to disappear. My father was right, she said. They knew people would believe the first version. Jonathan pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Then we do not give them time to publish it. What are you proposing? We secure the complete trust. We identify every person who authorized your placement. We trace the false records used against Marcus. And we preserve the evidence in more than one location. And Richard? We do not confront him yet. Annie studied him. That sounds difficult for a man who gives orders before he has answers. It is. Helen poured fresh coffee into Jonathan's cup. Growth often begins with discomfort, Mr. Whitmore. He looked at the coffee but did not argue. Owen's phone vibrated. He read the message, then turned the screen face down. What is it? Jonathan asked. Whitmore Health's legal office has requested Annie's personnel file, medication access history, and financial disclosure forms. Annie felt the warning immediately. They're building the first version, she said. Jonathan looked at Marcus's recorder resting on the table. Then we start writing ours. By 8:30 that morning, Owen had turned Helen's dining room into a temporary records office. Marcus's documents were spread across one end of the table, while Jonathan's laptop displayed old reports pulled from the family archive. Each file carried the same approval mark from Richard's office. Annie stood behind Jonathan, reading over his shoulder. The first report claimed Marcus had checked into a resort in Nassau 4 months after leaving Baltimore. A photograph showed a black man in sunglasses walking beside a hotel pool. That isn't my father, Annie said. Jonathan enlarged the image. The face is partially hidden. My father had a scar over his left eyebrow. This man doesn't. The resolution is poor. He's also wearing his watch on the right wrist. Dad wore his on the left because he broke his right wrist when he was 14. Jonathan looked at her. He fell from the roof of our father's garage. He told me he fell from a ladder. He lied because the roof was off limits. For a second, they shared the same memory from different years. Then Annie pointed back at the screen. That man isn't him. Owen opened the image metadata. The photograph was added to the report 6 months after the stated date. That doesn't prove it was altered, but it means it didn't come directly from the hotel. The next file contained bank statements showing Marcus spending thousands of dollars at restaurants in London and Paris. Annie read the dates. On this day, Dad was working a double shift at the hospital. "How can you be certain?" Jonathan asked. "It was my 8th birthday. He promised he'd come home for cake, but a boiler failed in the surgical wing." Mrs. Louise sat with me until almost midnight. Owen searched the employee records copied from locker 317. Marcus had signed into Whitmore Memorial at 6:08 that morning and signed out shortly after 11 at night. Jonathan leaned back. "So the bank statement was false. Or the account was real and someone else was using it," Owen said. Annie examined another document. It was a typed letter addressed to Jonathan. "I have the money. I have no intention of returning. Stop looking for me." The signature read, "Marcus Whitmore." "He wouldn't have signed that," she said. Jonathan looked at the bottom of the page. "Why not? My father signed his name Marcus Carter, even on old papers. He said Carter was the one name nobody had given him permission to carry." Helen, who had been listening from the kitchen, placed a plate of toast on the table. Denise made sure of that. She told Marcus a name should remind a child who loved him, not who owned him. Jonathan looked down at the letter. "I received 12 of these. Did you answer?" Annie asked. "At first." "What did you say?" Jonathan did not respond immediately. "That I wanted to meet, that the money could be returned quietly, that I could protect him if he cooperated." Annie's expression tightened. "You wrote to him like he was already guilty." "Yes. And when he didn't answer, I became angry." "Then what?" "I stopped writing." The honesty did not excuse him. But Annie had begun to understand that Jonathan's worst failures rarely came from open cruelty. He had done damage by accepting distance, by allowing other people to carry messages he should have delivered himself. Owen opened a folder marked Confidential Family Review. Inside were photographs of a man standing beside luxury cars, entering hotels, and boarding a private aircraft. None showed his face clearly. Every report ended with a short conclusion. Subject continues to reject family contact. No evidence of dependence. No indication he intends to return to Maryland. "No dependence," Annie said. "They erased me before I was old enough to know my own last name." Jonathan's eyes stayed on the screen. "I was told Marcus had no children. You believe that too?" The investigator had worked for the family for 23 years. "That isn't an answer." "No, it isn't." Jonathan closed the folder. "I believed people who told me what I expected to hear." Marcus had been accused of betraying us, and every report after that made the accusation feel more reasonable. I told myself I was protecting the company, the employees, the hospitals. "You were protecting yourself," Annie said. Jonathan met her eyes. "Yes." The room became quiet except for the hum of Owen's scanner. Annie moved away from the table and stood near the window. Across the street, a mail carrier walked from house to house, climbing the same 3 porch steps at every address. The ordinary rhythm of the morning felt separate from the life her father had hidden. "Richard created the lie," Jonathan said behind her. She turned. "But I chose to live inside it," he continued. "That choice belongs to me." It was the first time he had spoken without defending the younger man he had been. Owen's phone rang. He listened for less than a minute, then put the call on speaker. Eleanor's voice filled the room. "Whitmore Memorial has suspended Annie's internship pending an internal review." Annie looked at Jonathan. "For what?" "Unauthorized access to medication, breach of patient confidentiality, and possible interference with a prescribed treatment." "I never opened the bottle." "I know. My report says that clearly." "Then why suspend me?" "Because the order came from the executive legal office before my report was filed." Jonathan stood. "Who signed it?" "Richard Whitmore." A second notification appeared on Owen's laptop. He read it, then looked at Annie. "Your community college scholarship has also been placed under review." Annie's face went still. "The foundation funds it." "Yes." Jonathan reached for his phone. Annie stepped between him and the table. "What are you going to do?" "Call Richard." "And say what? That we found the locker? That we know about the trust?" "I will tell him to restore your scholarship. That tells him exactly how much you care about keeping me close." Jonathan stopped. She was right. Richard had spent 19 years controlling the story by watching how Jonathan reacted. An angry call would only confirm that Annie mattered. Owen turned the laptop toward them. A local news site had posted a short article less than 3 minutes earlier. "Teenage caregiver questioned after billionaire's medication incident." The photograph beneath the headline came from Annie's internship application. The article mentioned her unpaid hospital debt, her father's employment at Whitmore Memorial, and an unnamed source who claimed she had shown unusual interest in Jonathan's private medication. Helen read the first paragraph, then closed the laptop. They are doing to her what they did to Marcus. Annie stared at the dark screen. They're writing the first version. Jonathan placed his phone back on the table. Then we do not answer with a denial they can edit. What do we answer with? She asked. The records. The false photographs. The bank accounts. Your father's voice. We don't have enough yet. No, Jonathan said, but we know where the lies came from. Owen opened the authorization trail attached to the archived reports. Every payment to the private investigators had passed through the same office. Whitmore Family Trust, Chairman Emeritus. Richard's name appeared at the bottom of each approval. Jonathan looked at Annie. Justice is never fair when the powerful are allowed to write the first version of the truth. She recognized her own thought in his words. And now? She asked. Jonathan reopened the laptop. Now we make sure they don't get the final version. By noon, Annie's photograph was on 3 local news sites and 1 television screen in Helen's living room. The same image appeared each time. Her internship portrait, taken against a pale hospital wall, her hair pulled back. Her expression serious because the photographer had told her not to smile. The captions changed. Teen caregiver investigated after medication dispute. Billionaire's young employee linked to suspicious drug incident. Debt-ridden intern claims family connection to Whitmore fortune. No report mentioned the false hospital badge, the disabled call panel, or the second man who had entered Jonathan's room to confirm the drug's effects. None mentioned that Eleanor had signed the original medication log, or that the amber bottle did not appear in Jonathan's treatment plan. They found my financial records fast, Annie said. Owen muted the television. Your hospital debt was included in the internship disclosure forms. Legal had access. They made owing money sound like evidence. Helen set a cup of tea beside Annie. For some people, poverty is treated like a character flaw. It saves them the trouble of examining what actually happened. Jonathan stood at the far end of the dining table, reading a message from the Whitmore board. They've scheduled an emergency meeting for 3 this afternoon. To remove you? Owen asked. To request a temporary transfer of authority until my medical condition is reviewed. Annie looked at him. They're saying you're confused. They're saying I suffered an adverse reaction and became vulnerable to manipulation. By me. By a financially distressed young employee making an unverified claim of kinship. Jonathan read the phrase with controlled disgust. Helen folded her arms. They used more words so the prejudice would look professional. Jonathan's phone rang. Richard Whitmore's name appeared on the screen. No one spoke. Jonathan answered and placed the call on speaker. Jonathan, Richard said. His voice carried the patience of a man speaking to someone recovering from an illness. I've been trying to reach you. I've been occupied. I saw the reports. This situation is becoming embarrassing. For whom? For the family, the foundation, the hospital, and eventually for that young woman, whether she understands it or not. Annie's jaw tightened. Richard continued. You are unwell. A frightened girl has told you an emotional story, and now people around you are encouraging conclusions that could damage institutions serving thousands of patients. The medicine in my room was not prescribed. That is being investigated by the same legal office that suspended Annie before Eleanor filed her report. A pause followed. Richard's voice remained warm. You need rest. Let the professionals handle this. Which professionals? Adrian Cole? Adrian has cared for this family for decades. So I've been reminded. Richard let out a measured breath. Come to the board meeting. We will resolve this privately. Bring no documents and no outside counsel. The longer you allow this girl to remain near you, the worse this will look. Annie leaned closer to the phone. This girl has a name, she said. Richard went silent. Annie Carter, she continued. Marcus Carter's daughter. When Richard answered, the warmth had thinned. I know who you are. Jonathan looked at Owen. The admission was small, but none of them missed it. Annie asked, how? You applied to a Whitmore program. I was one of hundreds. Your father worked at our hospital. His name was bound to receive attention. Enough attention for your office to move my application off the waiting list? Richard did not answer directly. Young people sometimes mistake opportunity for conspiracy, and powerful people sometimes call a trap an opportunity. Jonathan reached for the phone. The meeting will proceed without me. You are making a serious mistake. No, I made the serious mistake 19 years ago. He ended the call. Owen immediately began saving the audio. He knew who she was before the internship. Jonathan said. It's useful, Owen replied, but not enough by itself. He can claim routine screening. Jonathan's phone vibrated again, this time with an alert from the company's banking office. His executive accounts had been temporarily restricted pending board review. They've frozen my authority over Whitmore Health Funds. Personal accounts? Owen asked. Not yet. Annie looked at the documents covering Helen's table. How many people at the company answer to Richard? Enough to slow us down, Jonathan said. Not enough to erase everything if we move first. Another call arrived, this one from Eleanor. The hospital has placed me on administrative leave, she said when Owen answered. They claim I failed to protect confidential medication records. You documented the breach, Annie said. That appears to be the problem. Are you all right? I've been a nurse for 34 years. I can survive a paid suspension. Her voice softened. Annie, reporters are outside your house. Mrs. Louise is refusing to let them onto the sidewalk in front of her property. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Mrs. Louise called Owen next. I've got 6 television people on this block, she said. One of them asked whether Marcus ever showed signs of criminal behavior. Annie closed her eyes. What did you say? I said he once stole 3 tomatoes from my garden, then came back the next morning and repaired my furnace for free. Helen almost smiled. Mrs. Louise continued. The church is holding a meeting tonight. Marcus fixed half the boilers in this neighborhood and never charged people who couldn't pay. They want to speak. Tell them not to, Annie said. Richard's people will go after them too, baby. Those people have buried husbands, raised children, survived layoffs, redlining, and politicians who only visit before elections. They know how to stand on a sidewalk. The call ended before Annie could argue. Jonathan looked at her. Your father had people. He had neighbors. Sometimes that is stronger. For the next 2 hours, evidence of Marcus's life began arriving. A retired custodian sent a photograph of him repairing a church furnace during a snowstorm. A former nurse remembered Marcus staying after his shift to fix a heater in the pediatric ward. A widower brought Mrs. Louise an old receipt marked paid, though Marcus had never accepted the money. None of it proved murder or fraud. It did something Richard's reports had never anticipated. It made Marcus visible as a person. Jonathan watched the messages accumulate. I had investigators sending me photographs from resorts. I never asked anyone who had lived beside him, because poor people weren't considered reliable witnesses, Helen said. Jonathan did not dispute it. Near sunset, Owen received another update. The board has voted to place Richard in temporary control of Whitmore Health until Jonathan completes an independent medical assessment. So he has the company, Annie said. For now. Jonathan looked toward her college acceptance letter, which lay beside Marcus's recorder. I can move you out of the country tonight, he said. There's a property in Nova Scotia held through a private trust. No Whitmore staff know about it. Annie stared at him. You want me to run? I want you alive. My father spent 18 years hiding so I could have a future. I'm not going to honor him by using that future to find a better place to hide. This is not about pride. No. It's about what happens after I leave. Richard says I invented everything. My scholarship disappears. My father stays a thief. You return once the board decides you're obedient again. I would not return. You don't know that. Jonathan looked as if he wanted to argue, but Annie continued. People like Richard count on everyone else being tired. They take a job, a house, a name, and wait for the person to become too exhausted to fight for it. Helen nodded. Silence protects reputations. It has never protected the innocent. Outside, car doors closed along the street. Through the window, Annie saw members of the neighborhood gathering in front of Mrs. Louise's house. Older men in work jackets stood beside women carrying church umbrellas. Someone held a photograph of Marcus in his maintenance uniform. A reporter raised a microphone. Mrs. Louise stepped onto her porch and said, Before you ask whether Marcus Carter was a criminal, you're going to hear who he was from the people who knew him. Annie watched from behind the curtain. For the first time since the story broke, Richard Whitmore was no longer the only person speaking to the public. Owen's phone sounded again. He read the message and looked at Jonathan. Someone just issued a search request for Annie's house and Marcus's employment records. Jonathan's expression hardened. Legal? No, Baltimore police. Annie turned from the window. Richard had moved beyond headlines and boardrooms. He was bringing the machinery of the city down on an 18-year-old girl before she could tell anyone why her father had died. Jonathan picked up Marcus's recorder. He thinks fear will separate us, he said. Annie took her father's note from the table. Then let's disappoint him. Owen gave them 12 minutes to leave Helen's house. The police request had not yet become a signed warrant, but he did not intend to wait for Richard's lawyers to find a judge willing to approve it. Eleanor arrived through the back entrance with Jonathan's medical bag and a change of clothes for Annie. Mrs. Louise agreed to keep reporters away from Annie's house, though she refused Owen's offer of private security. I've got a church full of retired teachers, nurses, and factory workers, she said over the phone. Your men would only block the driveway. They left Catonsville in 2 ordinary vehicles and drove east without using the highway. Owen changed direction several times before crossing the Bay Bridge and turning onto a narrow road near the Chesapeake shoreline. The safe house was a modest cedar-sided home surrounded by pine trees. Nothing on the property carried the Whitmore name. The furniture was plain. The refrigerator held more frozen meals than fresh food. And the living room television still had a built-in DVD player. Annie placed Marcus's recorder and documents on the kitchen table. This belongs to a billionaire, she asked. It belongs to a trust that does not appear in Whitmore records, Jonathan said. So this is where rich people hide when they're afraid? This is where cautious people go when someone tampers with their medication. Helen opened the freezer. Cautious people apparently live on frozen pizza and chicken noodle soup. She chose the soup. For the next 2 hours, Owen copied Marcus's files onto 3 encrypted drives. One went into his coat, one to Eleanor, and one inside a padded envelope addressed to a federal prosecutor he trusted. Jonathan recorded a short statement confirming where the documents had been found, and that Annie had not handled his medication beyond transporting the sealed package. Annie watched from the end of the table. You sound like you're preparing for something to happen. Jonathan stopped the recording. I am preparing so that nothing depends on one person surviving. The sentence unsettled her, though she knew he was right. By evening, rain had begun striking the roof. Helen heated the soup while Eleanor checked Jonathan's blood pressure. Annie sat nearby studying a printed chart of cardiac medications, trying to understand Marcus's notes about CV9. Jonathan's reading was lower than it had been that morning. You need to eat, Eleanor said. I'm not hungry. That was not a question. Annie looked up. Are your hands cold? Jonathan flexed his fingers. A little. Do you taste anything unusual? He hesitated. Jonathan. Metal. Eleanor immediately opened the medical bag. Jonathan remained calm. I didn't take the bottle. CV9 may have been administered in smaller amounts before tonight, Helen said. Marcus warned that it could accumulate. Annie remembered the private medication packages Jonathan had received during her 6 weeks at the estate. Every box had arrived sealed. Every delivery had carried valid paperwork. A valid form, she now understood, could still contain a lie. Eleanor attached a portable monitor to Jonathan's chest. His pulse was slowing, though not yet at a critical level. We need to identify everything he has taken over the last month, Annie said. That information is in the medication case, Eleanor replied. The black case sat beside the refrigerator. Annie opened it and began removing the labeled containers. Beneath the molded plastic insert, she noticed a small green light flashing once every few seconds. Owen. He crossed the room and examined it. A tracking device had been fixed to the underside of the case. No one spoke for a moment. Then the lights went out. The refrigerator stopped humming. The monitor continued on battery power, its beeping suddenly louder in the dark. Owen drew his phone. Stay away from the windows. A dull impact sounded near the back of the house. The security alarm did not activate. They cut the power before crossing the property, he said. They know the system. He guided Helen and Eleanor toward the basement door. Annie helped Jonathan stand, but he swayed as soon as he placed weight on his cane. I can walk. Not fast enough. Another sound came from the rear entrance. Wood cracked, followed by footsteps in the mudroom. Owen pushed a small flashlight into Annie's hand. Take Jonathan downstairs. Eleanor, stay with them. What about Helen? Annie asked. Helen had moved toward the hall to retrieve Marcus's documents from the table. Owen reached for her, but the side door opened before he could cross the room. A bright light swept through the kitchen. Owen stepped between it and Helen. Something struck him, and he fell against the counter, one hand closing around his shoulder. There was no gunshot, only a sharp hiss and the sound of a metal cylinder rolling across the floor. Smoke spread through the room. "Move," Owen shouted. Annie pulled Jonathan toward the basement. Eleanor helped from the other side while Helen disappeared behind the gray cloud. The basement door closed above them. Owen followed seconds later, breathing hard, blood darkening the shoulder of his shirt where broken glass had cut him. "Where is Helen?" Annie asked. Owen did not answer immediately. The sound of an engine rose outside and moved away through the rain. "They took her," he said. Annie started toward the stairs. Owen blocked the door. "They are gone. We can't leave her with them. And running into the yard will not bring her back." Jonathan gripped the railing, his face pale. The monitor beneath his shirt gave a warning tone. Annie forced herself to turn away from the stairs. "Sit him down." They lowered Jonathan onto an old couch. Eleanor checked his pulse while Annie opened Marcus's notes on her phone. "Stop his blood pressure medication," Annie said. "Dad wrote that CV9 becomes more dangerous when combined with it." Eleanor read the line and nodded. "She's right." Jonathan's phone rang. The number was hidden. Owen answered on speaker. Richard's voice came through clearly. "You have taken something that belongs to the family." Jonathan struggled to keep his breathing even. "You mean the evidence Marcus left?" "I mean property stolen from a Whitmore facility." "Where's Helen?" "Safe for the moment. Bring the recorder and every document to the foundation anniversary tomorrow night." "And if I refuse?" "Dr. Brooks has a weak heart. At her age, sudden cardiac arrest would surprise no one." The call ended. Jonathan pulled the monitor leads from beneath his shirt and tried to stand. "I want every loyal security officer we have." "For what?" Annie asked. "To bring Helen back and end this." "End it how?" Jonathan looked at Owen. "You know what I mean." Annie stepped between them. "If you deal with Richard in another locked room, he dies a respected man. My father remains a thief, and Helen becomes another old woman whose heart supposedly failed. He has her. That is why we need him exposed, not erased." Jonathan's anger faltered as another wave of dizziness forced him back onto the couch. Annie crouched in front of him. "My father left you his voice because he wanted the truth heard. Don't turn it into another family secret." For several seconds, Jonathan listened only to the monitor and the rain above them. Then he looked at Owen. "Set up the camera." Owen understood. He placed a phone on a shelf and began recording. Jonathan faced the lens. "My name is Jonathan Whitmore. 19 years ago, my brother Marcus was accused of stealing from our family. I accepted that accusation because believing it protected my company, my reputation, and my place in the family. I now know the evidence was false." He glanced at Annie before continuing. "I did not create the lie that destroyed my brother, but I accepted everything the lie gave me." Above them, the house had gone silent. By the time Jonathan finished, 3 copies of the statement were already traveling beyond Richard Whitmore's reach. At 6 the next evening, the Whitmore Health Foundation Hall glowed above Baltimore's Inner Harbor, as though nothing inside the family had begun to collapse. Black sedans stopped beneath the covered entrance. Board members, hospital executives, politicians, donors, and scholarship recipients passed through the glass doors beneath banners celebrating 75 years of service. A string quartet played near the registration desk while servers carried trays of crab cakes and sparkling water through the crowd. Annie watched from the rear seat of Owen's car across the street. Her borrowed black dress belonged to Eleanor's niece. It fit well enough, though Annie felt more comfortable in her nursing uniform. Marcus's storage key hung beneath the neckline on a thin cord. His recorder rested in Owen's locked case. "You don't have to enter with us," Jonathan said from the passenger seat. His color had improved since the night before, but Eleanor had placed a portable monitor beneath his shirt. He wore a tuxedo and carried his cane, looking once again like the man whose name appeared above the hospital entrance. Annie studied the bright windows. "Helen is in there." "We believe she is. Richard told us to come here. He wouldn't take her somewhere he couldn't control." Jonathan turned toward her. "You do not owe this family bravery." "I'm not doing this for the family." "For whom then?" "For my father, for Helen, for every patient whose death was turned into a line on a report because nobody thought their family could fight back." Jonathan nodded once. "Then we do it carefully." Owen reviewed the plan from the driver's seat. Eleanor had entered through the staff entrance 20 minutes earlier using credentials that had not yet been disabled. She would locate the private medical rooms and determine whether Helen had been admitted under a false name. Owen had sent encrypted copies of Marcus's recording, Jonathan's statement, and the financial documents to a federal prosecutor and 2 reporters. If I fail to enter the release code every 10 minutes, Owen said, everything goes public automatically. What if they take your phone? Annie asked. The system runs from an external server. Jonathan looked toward the hall. Richard expects us to bring the only copies. He has spent his life believing control and ownership are the same thing, Owen replied. Annie's phone vibrated. A message from Eleanor appeared. Old treatment wing, lower level. Room B, 14. Possible private transfer. Cole signed access. Annie showed the screen to Owen. Jonathan's jaw tightened. You stay with me until we are inside. Richard will be watching you, which is why he may not notice her, Owen said. Jonathan looked at Annie. If you find Helen, you leave immediately. You do not confront Cole. I understand. That answer sounded too easy. It's the answer you're getting. They crossed the street together. Inside the hall, guests turned when Jonathan entered. Conversations paused, then resumed in lower voices. Some people offered greetings. Others looked away. The news had spent the day portraying him as ill, unstable, and under the influence of a teenage opportunist. Richard stood near the stage speaking with 2 state senators and the hospital board chairman. He wore a white dinner jacket and a blue tie, the same colors used in the foundation banners. When he saw Jonathan, he smiled. The expression did not reach his eyes. You came, Richard said. You invited me. Richard's gaze moved to Annie. And you brought the girl. My niece, Jonathan said. The people nearest them went quiet. Richard recovered quickly. This is neither the place nor the time for private confusion. You made it public when your office released her personnel records. I protected the foundation from an accusation. You protected yourself from a question. Richard glanced toward Owen's case. Did you bring what I requested? Jonathan rested both hands on his cane. You'll receive it when I see Dr. Brooks. She is being cared for. By Adrian Cole? Richard's expression remained calm. You always become reckless when guilt is involved. Jonathan stepped closer. And you have always mistaken patience for obedience. A bell sounded from the stage, announcing that the program would begin in 15 minutes. Richard excused himself and walked toward the board members without answering. Owen leaned toward Jonathan. He looked at the case twice. Good. Let him believe everything is inside it. Annie slipped away while the guests moved toward their tables. Eleanor waited near a service corridor wearing her nursing coat over a dark dress. She handed Annie a temporary staff badge. The lower elevators require medical authorization, she said. This will get us to the basement, but Cole has restricted B14. Did you see Helen? Only her transfer record. No diagnosis, no insurance information, and no emergency contact. Someone entered her as Jane Brooks. Can we call the police? Owen already contacted a federal agent, but they need time. Richard owns enough local influence to delay anything that arrives without a signed warrant. Annie looked toward the ballroom doors. Applause began as the master of ceremonies introduced Richard. We don't have time. They entered the staff elevator. As the doors closed, Richard's voice came through the ceiling speaker. For 75 years, the Whitmore family has believed that access to care should never depend on a person's income, background, or place in society. Eleanor pressed the button for the lower level. My father repaired heat in this hospital because patients were cold, Annie said. Richard used the same building to erase him. Buildings do not decide what they represent, Eleanor replied. People do. The elevator opened onto a corridor with green walls and older fluorescent lights. The music and applause above them disappeared behind concrete. Room B14 stood at the end of the hall. A red authorization light glowed beside the door. Annie tried the temporary badge. Access denied. Eleanor attempted hers with the same result. From behind the door came the faint sound of metal striking a tray. Then Helen's voice, weak but clear. Adrian, if you intend to kill me, at least stop pretending this is medicine. Annie looked at Eleanor. A second voice answered from inside. You always did talk too much. Annie wrapped her fingers around Marcus's storage key beneath her dress. Above them, Richard Whitmore was speaking to hundreds of people about dignity. Below the stage, Annie began searching for another way into the room where his version of dignity intended to bury one more witness. Eleanor pointed toward a narrow service panel beside room B14. That wall backs onto the old supply corridor. Annie followed her around the corner and found a door marked housekeeping. Inside, Shelves of folded linens concealed a second entrance that had been painted over years earlier. Eleanor wedged a metal cart handle beneath the latch and pulled until the frame opened enough for Annie to slip through. The room smelled of alcohol wipes and stale air. Helen lay on a treatment bed with one wrist secured to the rail. Dr. Adrian Cole stood beside an IV pole, holding an amber vial with a blue-silver band. He looked at Annie without surprise. "Marcus's daughter," he said. "You have his talent for arriving where you don't belong." Annie moved toward Helen. "Let her go," Cole smiled. "Your father said the same thing about patients he had never met. He confused maintenance work with moral authority. He understood more about care than you ever did." Cole lifted a syringe. "Your father understood pipes and vents. Then he found records he wasn't qualified to read and decided he was a hero." Helen's voice was weak but steady. "He read them well enough to frighten you for 19 years. Cole turned toward her. Annie used the moment to pull the fire alarm beside the door. A bell exploded through the lower corridor. Red lights began flashing. Cole lunged for the treatment bed, but Eleanor pushed the supply cart through the opening and struck the IV stand. The syringe slipped from his hand. Annie reached for Helen's restraint. Cole caught her arm. She felt a sharp sting near her elbow before she tore free. The syringe fell to the floor. Eleanor saw the puncture. "How much?" "Not all of it." Cole backed toward the main door as the emergency lock released. "You have no idea what you've interfered with." Annie's mouth already tasted faintly of metal. "I know exactly what this drug does." Eleanor freed Helen while Annie grabbed the medical file from the counter. Marcus Carter's name appeared on the first page beside a toxicology code that had never been included in the official report. "Take that," Helen said. "It proves they tested for CV9 after Marcus died." Footsteps approached from the corridor. Cole fled through the unlocked door before hospital security arrived. Eleanor supported Helen while Annie walked beside them, one hand against the wall. Her fingers were becoming cold. "We need to get you treated," Eleanor said. "Jonathan first." "Annie." Cole said the drug worked through accumulation. "Jonathan has had weeks of doses." The ballroom was silent when they reached the upper level. Jonathan stood at the center of the stage. Behind him, the Foundation's anniversary video had been replaced by Annie's internship photograph and a scanned copy of Marcus's birth certificate. Richard remained near the podium. Jonathan addressed the audience. "The young woman my family has described as a desperate employee is Annie Carter Whitmore. She is my niece, Marcus Whitmore's daughter, and a lawful heir to the trust my uncle has spent 19 years trying to control." Whispers moved across the room. Richard approached the microphone. "My nephew is ill. This girl and her associates have taken advantage of his condition." Owen stepped beside the projection controls and opened the case he had carried into the hall. Marcus's recorded voice filled the speakers. "I did not steal the money. Richard moved it through an account opened under my name." Richard's face changed. The recording continued through the threat against Denise, the forced resignation, the false reports, and the warning about Cardiovex 9. Jonathan looked directly at his uncle. Was Marcus lying? Richard gripped the podium. Marcus was weak. He placed outsiders above the family that gave him everything. He was family. He was your father's mistake. The words traveled through every speaker in the room. Several guests stood. A reporter near the center aisle raised her phone and began recording. Richard realized too late that the argument was being streamed onto the screens behind him. Jonathan's voice remained controlled. "You removed him because you could not accept that a black woman's son would inherit the Whitmore name. I removed him because he threatened what generations of this family built." "And Annie?" Richard looked toward the ballroom doors, where Annie stood between Eleanor and Helen. She was never supposed to reach adulthood with a claim. The room erupted. Owen moved toward Richard, but Richard reached beneath his dinner jacket and drew a small handgun. The first shot struck the podium. The second hit Jonathan beneath the shoulder. Jonathan fell. Owen crossed the stage and forced Richard's arm downward before he could fire again. 2 federal agents entered from the side doors as guests scattered from their tables. Annie ran toward Jonathan. By the time she reached him, the portable monitor beneath his shirt was sounding a continuous warning. His skin was pale, his pulse slow. A physician from the audience knelt beside him. "We need epinephrine." "No," Annie said. The doctor looked at her. "Move back. CV9 reacts with his blood pressure medication. Standard treatment could make it worse." "How do you know?" "My father documented it." She opened Marcus's file with shaking hands, and showed him the handwritten notes. Eleanor arrived and confirmed the medication list. Stop the antihypertensive infusion. Prepare temporary pacing. And draw blood for the metabolite marked here. The physician read the page, then issued the orders. Jonathan's eyes opened briefly. Annie? I'm here. He looked toward Richard, now handcuffed beside the stage. Did they hear him? Everyone heard him. Jonathan tried to speak again, but Annie tightened her hand around his. Save your strength. You've asked enough questions for one night. His pulse began responding to the temporary pacer. Only then did Eleanor notice Annie swaying. Sit down. I'm fine. Jonathan managed the faintest breath of a smile. That, he whispered, is what Marcus always said. Annie lowered herself beside him as another medical team approached. Around them, the hall carrying the Whitmore name had become a crime scene, a press room, and the first place in 19 years where Marcus's truth had been heard without permission. 6 months later, the brass letters above Whitmore Memorial Hospital still carried the same family name, but almost everything behind them had changed. Richard Whitmore was being held without bail, while federal prosecutors prepared charges that included attempted murder, fraud, obstruction of justice, coercion, falsification of medical records, and conspiracy to violate patients' civil rights. Adrian Cole had been arrested 2 days after the Foundation Gala while attempting to cross into Canada under another name. Investigators found sealed vials of Cardiovex 9 inches, a private storage unit linked to his medical office, along with copies of altered toxicology reports. The original report on Marcus Carter's death had been among them. It showed that the hospital laboratory had detected a Cardiovex 9 metabolite in his blood. Cole had ordered the result removed before the official record was released to Annie. Marcus had not died from an undiagnosed heart condition. He had been poisoned. Annie sat in the front row of the hospital auditorium while an independent investigator read that conclusion aloud. Reporters filled the rear seats, but this time none of them had been permitted to publish her medical or financial records. Owen had insisted on written restrictions before she agreed to attend. Jonathan sat beside her with his left arm supported by a sling. The gunshot had damaged muscle but missed the major artery. His heart had taken longer to recover. Eleanor still checked his blood pressure twice a day, despite his insistence that he could do it himself. When the investigator finished, he placed a corrected copy of Marcus's death certificate on the table. Annie did not reach for it immediately. One sentence had changed. Cause of death. Deliberate administration of Cardiovex 9. The truth looked small on paper. A few typed words replacing another set of typed words. It could not restore the years Marcus had spent hiding, the jobs he had lost, or the night Annie had held his cold hand while strangers ordered her out of the room. Jonathan leaned toward her. You don't have to take it today. Yes, I do. She stood, crossed the stage, and accepted the document with both hands. The investigator lowered his voice. Miss Carter, on behalf of the Independent Commission, I am sorry. Annie looked at the audience. My father heard apologies from people who still expected him to remain silent, she said. I hope this one comes with action. It will. She nodded once and returned to her seat. Outside the auditorium, the hospital had removed Richard's portrait from the founder's wall. Several board members had resigned after investigators proved they had ignored irregularities in the family trust and patient safety reports. Others claimed they had known nothing. Helen had little patience for that defense. Not knowing is sometimes innocent, she told a congressional panel. Refusing to know is a decision. A temporary board now included nurses, patient advocates, neighborhood representatives, and relatives of people whose deaths had been linked to Cardiovex 9. Eleanor accepted a position overseeing medication accountability, but only after demanding that the office report to the independent board rather than the Whitmore family. Jonathan resigned as chairman of Whitmore Health Group. His advisors urged him to remain until the investigation ended. They argued that his removal would frighten investors and weaken the hospitals. Jonathan declined. At the press conference, he stood without the family crest behind him. I did not manufacture the evidence used against my brother, he said. I did not order the threats that forced him from this family, but I accepted the benefits of his absence. I believed reports that protected my position because questioning them would have required me to risk the company, the family name, and my own pride. A reporter asked whether he considered himself another victim of Richard's manipulation. Jonathan paused. I was deceived. Marcus was destroyed. Those are not the same thing. Annie watched from the side of the room. It was the first answer he had given that did not ask anyone to feel sorry for him. The courts restored Marcus's legal identity as Marcus Carter Whitmore. His forced resignation and waiver of inheritance were declared invalid. Jonathan insisted that the name Carter remain in every corrected document. It belonged to Denise, he told the attorneys. No part of Marcus should have to disappear for another part to be recognized. The assets owed to Marcus's estate passed to Annie, but she refused Jonathan's suggestion that a private financial manager take control of everything. I'm 18, not incapable. I know. You keep saying that right before suggesting someone manage my life. Jonathan considered this. Then choose your own advisor. I already did. She introduced him to a black attorney recommended by Helen, a woman who represented families harmed by medical institutions. Jonathan signed every document without objecting. The medical debt connected to Marcus's death was canceled. Additional compensation was placed in trust, but Annie used only a small portion for tuition and housing. The largest share went toward creating the Marcus Carter Whitmore Patient Safety Scholarship. At the first planning meeting, a public relations consultant suggested placing Jonathan's name beside Marcus's. Annie closed the folder. No. The consultant looked toward Jonathan for support. He shook his head. You heard her. The scholarship would assist students from low-income families entering nursing, pharmacy, hospital maintenance, and patient safety programs. Annie insisted on including maintenance workers. My father found the truth because he understood the building, she explained. People notice doctors when they enter a hospital room. They rarely notice the person who keeps the air moving, the lights on, or the machines from overheating. The old maintenance corridor was converted into a training center. Locker 317 remained in place behind protective glass. Marcus's work jacket hung inside it, beside a copy of his note and a photograph of him repairing the wooden boat with Jonathan. On the opposite wall were the names of the patients linked to Cardiovex 9. During the dedication, family members stood in silence as each name was read aloud. Mrs. Louise attended in a purple church hat and corrected two executives who tried to address her by her first name. It is Mrs. Bennett until I tell you otherwise, she said. Jonathan offered her his arm as they walked toward the memorial. I still haven't decided whether I like you, she told him. I assumed the review remained ongoing. It does. Annie heard them and smiled. After the ceremony, she found Jonathan alone beside Marcus's locker. He held the repaired watch but had not opened its clasp. The board approved your scholarship exactly as you designed it, he said. It isn't my scholarship. No, it's his. Annie looked through the glass at her father's jacket. He would have complained that everyone spent too much money on the room. He would have asked whether the heating system worked first. You remember that much? I remember more every day. Annie studied him. Remembering isn't the same as making things right. I know, but it's a start. Jonathan looked toward the wall of names. For once, he did not stand where he could watch the exit. The law had returned Marcus's name to the record, and the hospital had begun repairing the harm hidden beneath its polished floors. Yet Jonathan understood that no court could settle the debt between two brothers. There was still one place he needed to go, and one promise he could make only in front of the man who would never answer him. 6 days after the dedication, Jonathan drove Annie to Mount Auburn Cemetery in a dark blue sedan without a driver or security detail. The morning was cool, and the trees along the narrow road had begun to lose their leaves. Annie held the corrected death certificate inside a plain folder on her lap. Jonathan had placed Marcus's repaired watch in his coat pocket. Neither of them spoke during the drive. The new headstone stood near the back of the cemetery beneath an old maple tree. The original marker had carried only 2 words: Marcus Carter. Annie had chosen the new inscription herself. Marcus Carter Whitmore, beloved father, loyal brother, protector of the forgotten. Jonathan stopped several feet away. For a long moment, he appeared unable to move closer. Annie walked to the grave and placed a small bunch of yellow chrysanthemums beside the stone. They had been Marcus's favorite because they lasted longer than expensive flowers. Jonathan finally joined her. I thought you might change your mind about the name, he said. Carter belonged to my grandmother. Whitmore belonged to him too, even if the family tried to take it away. You made the right choice. It wasn't yours to approve. Jonathan lowered his head. No, it wasn't. He took the old watch from his pocket. The leather strap had been replaced, but the scratches across the back remained. Jonathan opened the clasp and rested the watch against the stone. Marcus repaired this for me before he disappeared, he said. I found it in his apartment. He must have kept it all those years. He kept a lot of things he claimed didn't matter. Jonathan looked at the photograph Annie had placed beside the flowers. Two young brothers stood near their wooden boat, unaware that one day pride, fear, and money would separate them. I used to think Marcus was the stubborn one, Jonathan said. He argued about everything. Which tools to buy, which road to take, whether the Orioles needed new pitching. They usually do. Jonathan gave a faint smile. He would have liked hearing you say that. The smile disappeared as he faced the headstone again. You tried to warn me, he said. You wrote. You came to the hospital. You trusted me to look past what they placed in front of me. Annie remained quiet. This was not a conversation she could finish for either brother. I let pride speak louder than love, Jonathan continued. I told myself I was protecting employees, hospitals, and the family name. The truth is that I protected the life I had because searching for you would have required me to risk it. A breeze moved through the branches above them. Dry leaves scraped across the grass. I cannot go back and become the brother you needed, Jonathan said. I cannot give Annie the years she should have had with her family. But I will not abandon her again. Annie turned toward him. Jonathan kept his attention on the grave. I will make sure she has the freedom to choose her own future. I will stand beside her when she asks and step back when she doesn't. I will never use money to decide what she owes me. Annie folded her arms against the cold. I don't need anyone to replace my father. Jonathan looked at her then. I know. I'm asking for the chance to become the uncle you should have had from the beginning. She studied his face. 6 months earlier, she would have heard only another wealthy man making a promise he had the power to break. Now she saw someone who had surrendered his company position, testified against his own family, and allowed Marcus's name to stand above his own. It did not erase 19 years. It did not require her to forgive him all at once. You don't get to decide when I need help, she said. Understood. You don't call my school unless I ask. I won't, and if I say no to something, you don't send Eleanor to convince me. Jonathan hesitated. Annie raised an eyebrow. I won't, he said. Then we can start there. They stood beside Marcus for another few minutes. When Annie finally walked toward the car, Jonathan fell into step beside her rather than behind her. 1 year later, Annie began the first day of her nursing program at Baltimore City Community College. She still carried Marcus's old backpack. The zipper had been replaced twice, and one strap was held together by stitching Mrs. Louise had reinforced with fishing line. Annie had enough money to buy a new one, but she saw no reason to discard something that still worked. Jonathan waited beside the curb in the same blue sedan. He had offered to drive her quietly, and Annie had accepted after making him promise not to speak to the dean, the instructors, or anyone responsible for admissions. You have your schedule? He asked. In my bag. Student identification? In my wallet. Lunch? Mrs. Louise packed enough food for 3 students. Jonathan nodded. Good. Annie opened the car door, but he stopped her by holding out a small box. Inside was Marcus's watch. I thought you left this at the cemetery. I went back for it the next morning. Your father repaired it for me, but I think he kept it for you. Annie lifted the watch from the box. The hands moved with a quiet, regular ticking. He never gave it to me. He may have been waiting for the right time. She fastened it around her wrist. Students crossed the campus carrying coffee, textbooks, and plastic folders. Some were Annie's age. Others were parents returning to school after years of work. Nobody knew she was an heir to a medical fortune, and that was how she wanted it. She took 2 steps toward the entrance, then turned. Uncle Jonathan? He went still. It was the first time she had called him that. Are you coming to graduation? His answer took a moment. I'll be in the front row. No press. No press. And no building named after me. Jonathan placed one hand over his heart. You drive a hard bargain. I'm a Whitmore. Apparently it runs in the family. This time they both smiled. Annie entered the college alone. Jonathan walked as far as the front steps, then stopped. He did not follow her inside or call after her with another warning. This was her path, not another future for the Whitmore family to arrange. That evening, Annie returned to the small house she had chosen near campus. The porch light was on. Jonathan was in the kitchen trying to heat a chicken pot pie. The crust had burned around the edges, and smoke drifted toward the alarm. You know ovens have temperature settings, right? Annie asked. I followed the instructions. That's what people say right before something goes wrong. Jonathan looked at her, then at the ruined pie. Annie began to laugh. The sound filled the house while the porch light continued burning outside. Family had not been saved by wealth, blood, or the name carved above a hospital door. It had been saved by a young woman who refused to let the dead be lied about, and by a man who finally learned that love meant standing beside the truth, even when the truth took everything away. This story reminds us that injustice survives when good people choose silence, while truth gains power when ordinary people refuse to be intimidated. Real justice is not only about exposing those who abuse wealth, race, or authority, but also about restoring the dignity of those whose voices were ignored. Annie's courage shows that one determined person can challenge a powerful system, and Jonathan's journey proves that redemption begins when we accept responsibility, face painful truths, and choose love over pride. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only,